Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next games are Clu Clu Land and versus Clu Clu Land. Now, if you're like me, you might see this title and think, what on earth is a Clu Clu? Well, it turns out this is actually a translation that essentially completely removes the meaning from the Japanese version of the name. In Japan, the game is called Clu Clu Land, which is an onomatopoeia for the sound of spinning. Wait, a sound of spinning? What sound? Well, if you didn't know, in Japan, they use sound effects for a ton of different things, even for stuff that don't actually make a sound. In a way, I can see why this is a hard title to translate, but there's probably a different approach they could have taken that might have made a bit more sense. Similar to essentially every other NES title at this point, this one also received a Versus System version. However, unlike most of the Versus System games, it doesn't seem like this one ever released in the West. On the flyer for the Japanese version of the arcade port, we can see one of the characters ask the reader if they want to kudu kudu. In this one, you play as Bubbles, a balloon fish. If you saw my video on Pinball, you might remember that this character technically made their first appearance in the US version of Versus Pinball. One thing to note about this character is that she is the very first female protagonist in a Nintendo game. Well, sort of. In the Japanese version, the character's gender is never specified, and it was only in the West that Nintendo of America decided to refer to the character as a female. I don't know if this was a decision the original developers approved of, or if Nintendo of America just made the decision on their own. Alright, let's jump into the actual game. This one is basically a puzzle game, where your goal is to navigate through the water and reveal all of the gold ingots. What makes this one really unique is that the way you actually control your character is not by simply moving in the direction you want to go. Your character will always move forwards, and pressing the D-pad will cause Bubbles to extend her arm out and grab onto one of the many turn posts laid out throughout the level in a grid. Doing so will cause Bubbles to start spinning around the post, hence the kudu kudu part of the name. You can then release during the spin and start moving in a different direction. Of course, this doesn't completely cover every possible direction, so sometimes you have to reverse by bouncing off the walls. This control scheme is really unique, and I haven't really played a whole lot of games like this. This can be really hard to get the hang of, especially when you start to move fast in high-pressure situations. However, I think learning to master the skill is a big part of what makes this game fun. The ingots themselves are hidden, so unless you've memorized the levels, you don't really know where all the ingots are going to be located, although they often make shapes that can help you figure out where to search for them. You make shapes like the face of a bear, a pair of glasses, or a submarine. There are a few components that make this game challenging. The first of these are the sea urchin enemies, the Unira. These enemies patrol the stage, and if one touches you, you'll pop and lose a life. You can shoot out a beam of shockwaves by pressing either the A or B buttons, which will cause them to become stunned. In this state, they cannot move, and you can even push them into the wall to crush them to earn some extra points. Once you've defeated them, they will eventually respawn from one of these weird whirlpool-looking things. Since they respawn anyway, I would often just leave them stunned and ignore getting the extra points, and focus more on finding the ingots. You've got an infinite amount of firepower, which might seem overpowered at first, but this game's spinning mechanics can make them surprisingly difficult to hit, especially as things start to speed up. Those whirlpools do more than just spawn enemies too. If you pass over one, you'll get sucked inside. However, you can pass over them safely if you're holding onto a post when you pass over them, which is even required in some of the harder stages. Apparently, the manual calls these things black holes, but something tells me that if these were actually black holes, they'd be a lot more problematic. Another obstacle that's a little less fatal is that there are rubber straps hidden in some of the stages. Finding one of these will cause you to suddenly get bounced backwards. The worst part about these, though, is that they completely remove the turn post next to the traps, despite the fact that you can use them before you reveal the trap. This can become especially devious in stages that are covered in rubber traps, with one stage in particular becoming extremely difficult to navigate through if you've revealed too many of them. The final component you have to worry about is the timer. Each level has a time limit, and you'll lose a life once it runs out. This is pretty generous at first, but it can become a real problem as you progress through the game. The music starts to speed up once your timer is almost up, which only adds to the stress. There's one final mechanic to go over. There are various items that can appear on the stage. Sometimes these will be placed on the stage at the start, but oftentimes you have to find them by passing over random spots. Most of these items will give you extra points, but there's also a timer and a flag, which are both pretty useful. The timer immediately pauses all the enemies on the screen for a brief time, and it will also cause the time limit to pause too. The flag gives you an extra life, so I found these in particular to be especially valuable. Alright, let's see how my first run went. I actually played this one a decent amount as a kid, through the NES item in Animal Crossing. Because of this, I already had a decently good handle on the controls, which helped a lot in this run. In the first level, you move pretty slowly, which makes it pretty easy to beat. I made the shape of some kind of human or robot, and the level was complete. After this, you move on to a new color scheme and stage layout. In this stage, I embarrassingly lost my first life to one of the Unira. The rest of the stage went smoothly though, and I made the shape of a bear. The next stage changed colors once again, and in this one I made a pair of glasses. After clearing this one with ease, I moved on to stage 4. This one introduces a new mechanic. Some of the walls are open, and passing through them will cause you to loop to the other side, similar to Pac-Man. There's a lot more black holes and rubber traps in this one, so it's a bit more difficult. Additionally, in this one, the ingots don't make any sort of identifiable shapes, though the patterns are still relatively easy to follow. After this one is the hardest stage type, the orange stage. These are the ones that are covered in rubber band traps that I mentioned before. The shapes you make in this one are the most difficult too. I had a bit of trouble finding the final gold ingot in this one, but I eventually found it in the center. After this, you are sent to a bonus game. Here, you are trying to reveal as many ingots as you can before the time runs out. It's actually pretty tough to get them all, and it wasn't until versus Clu Clu Land that I finally managed to full clear the bonus. After this, you are sent back to the green stage, which is what they used for round 2. While the overall layout is the same, the actual patterns you need to create is different from before. The way this game actually works is that there are 4 different variations of each stage, and it will randomly select which version you play each time you get to it. Every time the stages loop, it'll make sure you are playing on a pattern you haven't reached yet. This means that if you clear 4 total loops, you'll have seen just about every level, with the exception of the red stages, which are only present on the first loop. While I think beating 1 loop is probably good enough, I figured I might as well go for 4 loops since I was doing pretty good this run. The speedruns for this game are even separated into 2 different categories for these, calling 1 loop the low percent run and 4 loops the 100% run. For the second loop, things were going pretty well. That is until I reached the final level. I lost a couple of lives to a black hole and an Unira. Up next was loop 3. Once again, this loop went pretty easy for the first few stages, but again I struggled on the last level. For some reason, I could not figure out that I missed some of these ingots on the bottom left. I ended up losing lives to both the Uniras and the black holes, and it was here that I first ran out of time too. I did eventually figure it out though, although my lives had taken a notable hit. Next up was loop 4, the final loop I wanted to beat. Things started to get really fast here, and I started to struggle even on the normal stages. I lost 2 lives to the green stage, 1 to the blue stage, and after losing another life to the purple stage, I only had 1 life left. I moved on to the final level with only a single life remaining. This is going to be difficult. I had a few close calls, but somehow I actually managed to pull it off. I had beaten 4 loops and seen all the main stages in the game. While the stages do start to repeat at this point, they make one final change to the game to make it even harder. Passing over an already discovered gold ingot will cause it to flip upside down. To win now, you must have all the ingots face up, which could get pretty tough as you got near the end of the stage. While I did manage to beat the first level with this mechanic in play, I lost my last life to the blue level afterwards. With this, I was content with my time with the game. Clu Clu Land complete. Up next was versus Clu Clu Land. While this version is largely the same, there were some changes here and there. The first of these changes was that if you stayed on the title screen for long enough, it would show you the cast of characters. Really, this was more of a guide on how to play the game, as it included some of the mechanics like the gold ingots and bonus items. The big thing I learned from this though, was that this version of the game apparently includes some kind of secret character called the Boss Unira. While they didn't tell you how to encounter this thing, I knew I wanted to see it at least once. The other big change here is that they've added a ton of new stage variants too. Instead of there just being 4 variants of each of the 5 stages, there are now 8 variants of each stage. That means if you wanted to see every variant beside the red stages in a single run, you would need to beat 8 total loops or 41 total rounds. Maybe I'll just stick to a single loop for this one. I'll at least try to beat the preset high score for this one though too. I'm not sure if something about this one is harder, or if I just lost all my groove between games, but I struggled more with this version. On my first attempt, I lost all my lives to the purple stage in the first loop. Ouch. Thankfully, I did a lot better on my second run. I beat a loop this time, although unfortunately, I only got second place on the leaderboard. At this point, I decided for sure that I was not going to go for all 8 loops, but I figured beating the top score was still doable, so I gave it another try. I only made it 1 stage further on my third attempt than my second run, and as a result, I was just shy of the top score. Come on. On my next attempt, I finally did good enough. I beat 2 total loops before losing my last life, and soundly placed myself at the top of the leaderboard. I was pretty content with the game at this point, but hold on, where the heck was the boss Unira? It turns out, this thing only shows up after beating a bunch of normal Unira enemies on a single stage. Of course, I wanted to see this, so I started one last run. After defeating a bunch of Unira on stage 2, the boss Unira finally spawned. This thing was huge. However, other than its large stature, it wasn't actually all that tough to deal with. You can stun him just like the regular enemies, and pushing him up against the wall and squishing him will earn you a ton of points. Totally worth it. Now that I finally saw this, I was content with the game, and both Clu Clu Land and versus Clu Clu Land were complete. On to the reviews. This one is really unique. The way you move and beat each stage isn't quite like anything I've played before, and I find trying to get good at the game to be pretty fun. In particular, while I didn't play it here, I remember the 2-player mode to be a fun and chaotic time. That all being said, as many of you probably already know, I'm personally not into high score chasers as much as others. I find they often get pretty repetitive for me, and I don't really find the desire to beat my own high score as a particularly enticing motivator. While not everything here is to my personal taste, this one definitely stands out as a unique and well thought out title. I gave both versions of the game a 7 out of 10. If you really like arcadey high score chasers, I'd recommend giving this one a shot. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.